My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old. Until 8 months ago, I believed that blood was thicker than water and that family always came first. I spent my entire life being the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept everyone happy. For 29 years, I thought my little brother Marcus was just passionate and protective of our family. I never imagined that passion would turn into a fist connecting with my jaw while he screamed that I wasn't really family anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When my husband David witnessed what happened that 4th of July afternoon, he didn't just comfort me or tell me to forgive and forget like everyone expected. Instead, he looked Marcus dead in the eye and said something that would change everything. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life. You're going to hear from my lawyer." That's when I realized I had married a man who would actually fight for me, not against me. The story of how I met David feels like a lifetime ago now, back when I still believed that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my dignity. It was 6 years ago at the annual Texas Education Conference in downtown Austin. I had been teaching 3rd grade at Sunset Elementary for 3 years, and honestly, I was burned out. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and I was spending my own money on classroom supplies because the school district's budget was practically non-existent. I was sitting in the back of a particularly boring session about standardized testing protocols, scrolling through my phone and seriously considering a career change, when this man in a perfectly tailored Navy suit walked in. He wasn't like the other attendees, most of whom were tired teachers in comfortable shoes and wrinkled blazers. This guy looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not a school conference. He had dark hair that was just slightly messy in that intentional way, and when he smiled at the presenter, I noticed he had the kind of confidence that comes from actually knowing what you're talking about. During the break, I was refilling my coffee cup when he approached me. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice had this warm, professional quality that immediately put me at ease. "I'm David Mitchell. I'm here representing the legal aid clinic that's partnering with the district on some policy reforms. I couldn't help but notice you looked about as thrilled to be here as I feel." I laughed despite myself, and that's when I really looked at him. He had these incredibly kind brown eyes, and when he smiled, it reached all the way up to them. We ended up talking through the entire next session, sitting in the hallway with our coffee cups, completely ignoring the presentations we were supposed to be attending. David explained that he was a corporate lawyer at a downtown firm, but he did pro bono work with the school district because he believed education was the foundation of everything. He asked me about my classroom, about my students, about what I needed to be successful. Not in that condescending way that politicians do when they're trying to score points, but he genuinely wanted to understand my world. When I told him about how I spent my weekends at garage sales looking for books and supplies for my classroom, he didn't just nod sympathetically, he pulled out his phone and started making notes. "What's your school's address?" he asked. "I know some people who might be able to help with that." I gave it to him, thinking he was just being polite. But the following Monday, a delivery truck showed up at Sunset Elementary with enough books and supplies to stock 3 classrooms. The note attached simply said, "Every teacher deserves the tools to succeed, David." That's the kind of man I married. The kind who doesn't just talk about making things better, but actually does something about it. The kind who sees a problem and immediately starts working on solutions. Looking back now, I realize that moment should have shown me exactly how he would respond when someone hurt the person he loved. But at the time, I was just amazed that someone like him would be interested in someone like me. Our first official date was at Hill Country Coffee, this little place in South Austin that makes the best breakfast tacos in the city. David had suggested dinner at some fancy restaurant downtown, but I told him I was more of a coffee and tacos kind of girl. Instead of seeming disappointed, he lit up. "Perfect," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that. I hate pretentious restaurants anyway." We sat outside on their little patio, talking until they started stacking chairs around us and we realized they were trying to close. David told me about growing up in Dallas, the son of 2 public school teachers who had instilled in him a deep respect for education and public service. His parents had worked 2 jobs each to put him through law school, and he'd spent his first few years at a big corporate firm paying off student loans and sending money home to help with his younger sister's college expenses. "I always knew I wanted to do work that mattered," he said, stirring sugar into his third cup of coffee. "Money's nice, but at the end of the day, I want to know I made someone's life better." I shared my own story about growing up in a working-class Irish family where education was valued but not always financially supported. My parents, Robert and Carol Thompson, had immigrated from County Cork in the early 80s, with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. Dad had started Thompson Auto Repair in a tiny garage and built it into a successful business through sheer persistence and honest dealing. Mom had worked as a nurse until my youngest brother Marcus was born, then stayed home to raise the three of us kids. My older sister Emma had always been the rebel, the one who questioned family traditions and eventually moved to Houston after marrying her college boyfriend. I was the middle child, the responsible one, the one who studied hard and never caused trouble. And Marcus was the baby, the only son, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. Even as kids, there was this understanding that the family business would eventually be his, that he was carrying on the Thompson name and legacy. David listened to all of this without judgment, asking thoughtful questions about family dynamics and traditions. When I mentioned how sometimes I felt invisible in my own family, how my achievements were celebrated but never quite measured up to Marcus's latest accomplishment, David reached across the table and took my hand. "You're not invisible to me," he said simply. "You're extraordinary." That was the beginning of everything. David had this way of making me feel seen, valued, important. Not just as someone's daughter or sister or teacher. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as Sarah, as myself. When I got excited about a new teaching technique I'd discovered, he'd listen with genuine interest and ask follow-up questions. When I was frustrated about budget cuts or difficult parents, he'd offer practical advice, or just hold me while I vented. He never tried to fix everything for me, but he was always there, solid and supportive and completely in my corner. Our relationship developed naturally over the following months. David would pick me up after school sometimes, showing up in his expensive car but never making me feel self-conscious about my 10-year-old Honda Civic. He'd bring coffee for the entire teaching staff and stay to help me set up bulletin boards or grade papers. The other teachers started calling him Mr. Sarah, which made both of us laugh. He fit seamlessly into my world, but he also expanded it, taking me to art galleries and symphony concerts, and introducing me to experiences I'd never had growing up. When I brought David home to meet my family for the first time, about 4 months into our relationship, I was nervous in a way I'd never been before. This man was so polished, so successful, so different from the guys I'd dated in college or the few teachers I'd gone out with over the years. I worried that my family would find him pretentious, or that he'd find them rough around the edges. The dinner was at my parents' house in South Austin, the same ranch-style home where I'd grown up, with its worn furniture and family photos covering every surface. Mom had spent the entire day cooking, making all of Marcus's favorite foods because he was bringing his new girlfriend Jessica, and she wanted everything to be perfect. Emma had driven in from Houston with her husband Carlos, and the house felt full and chaotic in the way that Thompson family gatherings always did. David showed up with flowers for my mom and a bottle of good whiskey for my dad, which immediately earned him points. He complimented Mom's cooking genuinely and spent 20 minutes in the garage with Dad, looking at the classic Mustang Dad was restoring. When Marcus started telling stories about his construction crew, David listened with real interest, asking about building techniques and safety regulations. He didn't talk down to anyone or try to impress them with legal jargon. He was just himself, warm and interested and respectful. But I noticed things that night that I probably should have paid more attention to. The way Marcus's jaw tightened when David mentioned his salary range during a casual conversation about Austin's cost of living. The way Jessica's eyes narrowed when she saw David's watch and started asking pointed questions about his job and his family's background. The way my parents seemed almost surprised that I had attracted someone so obviously successful and stable. After dinner, while the women were cleaning up in the kitchen, I overheard Marcus talking to Dad in the living room. He seems nice enough, Marcus was saying. But isn't he a little out of Sarah's league? I mean, what's a hotshot lawyer want with a elementary school teacher? Dad's response was quiet, but I caught the gist of it. Something about Sarah being a good girl who deserved happiness, but also an acknowledgement that the match seemed unlikely to last. That conversation stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I doubted David's feelings for me, but because it revealed what my own family really thought of me. In their minds, I was settling. David was slumming, and the whole relationship was probably temporary. When David and I talked about it later, he was furious on my behalf. "Your family doesn't see your worth," he said, pacing around his apartment. "You're brilliant, you're dedicated, you're changing kids' lives every single day. What you do matters more than what I do." That's when I knew I was falling in love with him, not just because he was handsome or successful or treated me well, but because he saw me in a way that no one else ever had. He valued my work, my intelligence, my character. He never made me feel like I needed to change or improve or become someone different to deserve his attention. With David, I could just be Sarah, and that was enough. More than enough, it was everything. The proposal came 2 years later, on a weekend trip to Fredericksburg during peach season. We were staying at this little bed and breakfast, walking through the orchards in the early morning light, when David suddenly stopped walking and got down on one knee right there between the peach trees. The ring was perfect. A simple solitaire that caught the sunlight and threw little rainbows across the grass. "Sarah Elizabeth Thompson," he said, and his voice was shaking just slightly. "You make every day better just by being in it. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" I said yes before he even finished the question, and we spent the rest of the morning sitting under the peach trees, talking about our future. David wanted children eventually, but he was willing to wait until I felt ready. He wanted to buy a house with a big yard and room for me to have a home office where I could work on lesson plans and grading. He talked about traveling together, maybe taking a sabbatical year to teach English abroad through one of those volunteer programs. Everything he described sounded perfect, not because it was fancy or expensive, but because it was us, together, building something meaningful. The wedding planning process revealed even more about our family's different approaches to life. David's parents, both retired teachers living comfortably but modestly in Dallas, were thrilled about our engagement and immediately offered to help with whatever we needed. They welcomed me warmly into their family, treating me like the daughter they'd never had. David's sister Rebecca, a social worker in San Antonio, became one of my closest friends and eventually my maid of honor. My family's reaction was more complicated. Mom and Dad were happy for me, genuinely so, but there was this underlying current of anxiety about whether I was getting in over my head. They worried about fitting in with David's more educated family, about whether I'd remember where I came from once I was married to a lawyer. Marcus was openly skeptical, making jokes about how long it would be before David got tired of slumming it with a teacher and traded up to someone more appropriate for his social status. The worst part was Jessica's influence on the family dynamic. She had married Marcus the year before in a wedding that had stretched my parents' finances to the breaking point, and she'd spent the months since then making subtle comments about how the Thompson family needed to raise their standards and expectations. When she heard about my engagement, her first question wasn't congratulations, but rather, "Did you sign a prenup? To protect both of your interests." The suggestion that I might be marrying David for his money was so offensive that I actually walked out of my parents' house that day. David found me sitting in my car in their driveway, crying from frustration and hurt. He didn't say anything at first, just got in the passenger seat and handed me tissues until I was ready to talk. When I finally explained what Jessica had said and how no one in my family had defended me, David was quiet for a long moment. "Do you want a prenup?" he finally asked. "Because if it would make you feel more secure, or if it would shut Jessica up, I'm happy to do one. But just so you know, everything I have is already yours in my mind. The day I proposed, you became my family, my priority, my person. Whatever legal documents we sign or don't sign doesn't change that." That's the thing about David that my family never understood. His money, his success, his education, none of that was what made him who he was. He was generous and protective and loyal not because of his background but because of his character. He would have been the same man if he'd been a struggling public defender or a social worker, or a teacher like his parents. The law degree and the salary were just tools he used to take care of the people he loved and to make the world a little bit better. We ended up not getting a prenup, partly because neither of us wanted one, and partly because I refused to let Jessica's cynicism influence one of the most important decisions of my life. The wedding itself was beautiful. A small ceremony at a historic chapel in Austin, with a reception at a local restaurant that served the kind of food both our families could enjoy. Emma gave a toast that made everyone cry, talking about how David had brought out a confidence in me that she'd always known was there but that the family had never really encouraged. Even Marcus seemed to warm up to David that day, especially after David made a point of asking him to be part of the wedding party as a groomsman. In his wedding speech, Marcus talked about how protective he'd always felt of his big sister, and how glad he was that she'd found someone who would take care of her the way she deserved. At the time, those words meant everything to me. Looking back now, knowing what I know, they feel like a cruel joke. But that night, dancing with my new husband under string lights in the restaurant's garden, surrounded by everyone we loved, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. David spun me around and pulled me close, whispering in my ear about how excited he was to start our real life together. "It's just the beginning, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, and the way he said my new name made me believe that everything from that point forward would be perfect. How naive I was to think that love and good intentions would be enough to protect us from the ugliness that was already brewing in my family. How foolish to believe that Marcus's apparent acceptance of David was genuine, rather than a temporary performance for the sake of family harmony. And how completely unprepared I was for the moment when that facade would finally crumble, revealing the depth of resentment and entitlement that had been growing underneath for years. But on that perfect wedding night, with David's arms around me and our future stretching out bright and full of possibility, I couldn't have imagined that the brother who had just welcomed my husband into our family would one day tell me I didn't belong in it anymore. The first 2 years of marriage felt like living in a fairy tale that I never wanted to end. David and I settled into our townhouse in Cedar Park, a cozy 3-bedroom place with a big kitchen where we could cook together, and a small office that David insisted I use for my teaching materials. He converted the 3rd bedroom into a home office for himself, complete with law books and a massive desk, where he'd work on his pro bono cases in the evenings. Our routine was perfect in its simplicity. David would leave for his downtown law firm around 7 in the morning, always kissing me goodbye and leaving a fresh cup of coffee on my nightstand. I'd get to Sunset Elementary by 7:30 to prep for my 3rd graders, who had somehow become even more energetic and curious under my guidance. The classroom David had helped supply was now a model that other teachers came to observe, and I'd been selected to mentor new teachers in the district. Evenings were our sacred time. David would pick me up from school at least twice a week, and we'd explore Austin together. Food trucks downtown, live music at Zilker Park, hiking trails around the Greenbelt, art shows in the Warehouse District. David had this way of finding adventure in ordinary moments. He'd research the best breakfast tacos in the city, and we'd spend Saturday mornings on a quest to try them all. He'd discover a new hiking trail and surprise me with a picnic lunch to enjoy at the summit. Weekends often meant working together on house projects. David was surprisingly handy for a lawyer, and he taught me how to install crown molding and refinish furniture. We painted every room in colors I loved, deep blues and warm grays that felt both sophisticated and homey. The house began to reflect both of us, with David's law books mixed in with my teaching resources, his sleek modern furniture balanced by the vintage pieces I'd collected over the years. Our social life expanded naturally. David's colleagues from the law firm became our friends, and their wives welcomed me warmly into their circle. These were educated, accomplished women who ran nonprofits, practiced medicine, or had their own successful businesses. At first I felt intimidated, but they were genuinely interested in my work as a teacher and often asked for advice about their own children's education. Lisa Chen, who taught 4th grade at my school, became my closest friend during this period. She and her husband Mark, a software engineer, would come over for dinner parties that David and I loved hosting. Our kitchen table became the gathering place for passionate discussions about everything from education policy to local politics, to the best barbecue joints in Texas. David had a gift for making everyone feel heard and valued, and our house became known as the place where interesting conversations happened. I was thriving professionally in ways I'd never expected. The success of my classroom led to opportunities I'd never imagined. The school district asked me to present at conferences about innovative teaching methods. I was selected for a leadership development program that would eventually qualify me to become a principal. David celebrated every achievement like it was his own, taking me out for fancy dinners and telling everyone who would listen how proud he was of his brilliant wife. When I was invited to speak at the same Texas Education Conference where we'd met, David took the day off work to come listen to my presentation. Afterward, he stood up, during the question period, and asked a thoughtful question about funding challenges that made me look even more knowledgeable. Later, he told me he'd been so nervous for me that his hands were shaking, but that watching me command that room full of educators was one of the proudest moments of his life. Our financial situation was comfortable in a way I'd never experienced growing up. David's salary allowed us to travel, to eat at nice restaurants occasionally, to buy quality furniture that would last for decades. But he was never flashy about money, never made me feel like I wasn't contributing equally to our life together. He set up a joint account where both our paychecks went, and we made all financial decisions together. When I wanted to spend my own money on classroom supplies, he'd quietly reimburse me from his personal account, saying that supporting education was his privilege. The most beautiful part of our early marriage was how David supported my relationship with my family, even when it wasn't easy. He remembered my parents' anniversary and sent flowers. He never forgot Marcus's birthday, always picking out thoughtful gifts related to construction or tools. When my mom mentioned wanting to see a particular show at the Bass Concert Hall, David quietly bought tickets for all of us and presented them as an early Christmas gift. He was patient with the family dynamics that sometimes frustrated me. When Marcus would make comments about David's job being easier than real work, David would laugh it off and ask genuine questions about whatever construction project Marcus was working on. When Jessica would make pointed remarks about our house or our furniture or our vacation plans, David would redirect the conversation smoothly, never letting her barbs land or create awkwardness. The holidays during those first 2 years were magical. David embraced all the Thompson family traditions, from Mom's elaborate Christmas morning breakfast to Dad's 4th of July barbecue competition with the neighbors. He learned to play dominoes with my uncles and remembered all my cousins' names and ages. At family gatherings, he'd often end up in the kitchen with the women, helping with dishes and listening to family stories, while the men watched football in the living room. I loved watching him with my nephews, Emma's boys, who were 7 and 9 years old. David would get down on the floor and play with them for hours, building elaborate Lego cities or teaching them card games. The boys adored him, always asking when Uncle David was coming to visit and begging him to stay longer when we had to leave. Emma would catch my eye across the room and smile, knowing how much those moments meant to me. Our own conversations about children became more frequent and more specific during this period. David wanted to be a father, but he was content to wait until I felt ready. We'd lie in bed on Sunday mornings, talking about names we liked and what kind of parents we wanted to be. David spoke about wanting to coach Little League and help with science fair projects. I talked about reading bedtime stories and teaching our kids to garden. These weren't just dreams anymore, they were plans we were making together. The security I felt in those days was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. David's love was steady and reliable and unconditional. When I had a bad day at school, he'd listen without trying to fix everything. When I was stressed about family obligations, he'd offer practical solutions or just hold me until I felt better. When I doubted myself or my abilities, he'd remind me of my strengths with specific examples and genuine admiration. I started to understand what a healthy relationship actually looked like. David never raised his voice, never made me feel stupid or small, never dismissed my concerns or feelings. When we disagreed about something, which wasn't often, we'd talk it through until we found a solution that worked for both of us. He respected my opinions, valued my input, and treated me like an equal partner in every aspect of our life together. Looking back now, I realize those 2 years were when I finally became the person I was always meant to be. Away from the family dynamics that had shaped me for so long, supported by a man who saw my worth clearly, I blossomed in ways that surprised even me. I became more confident in my teaching, more assertive in expressing my opinions, more comfortable taking up space in conversations and social situations. David would often comment on these changes, always with pride and encouragement. "You're so much more yourself lately," he'd say, watching me laugh with friends at a dinner party. I love seeing you shine like this. He never took credit for my growth, but he created the safe space where it could happen. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen and valued for who I was, not for who I was supposed to be or who others wanted me to be. Our marriage felt unshakable during this period. We'd weathered small challenges together and emerged stronger each time. When David's firm went through a restructuring that temporarily threatened his job, we supported each other through the stress and uncertainty. When I had a difficult parent who questioned my teaching methods publicly at a school board meeting, David attended the next meeting and spoke eloquently about my qualifications and dedication. We were a team, facing whatever came our way together. The physical intimacy between us deepened during this time as well. David was patient and attentive, always making sure I felt comfortable and cherished. Our connection went beyond the physical, though. It was emotional and intellectual and spiritual. We could talk for hours about anything and everything, or sit in comfortable silence reading books together. We had inside jokes and shared dreams and a private language that belonged only to us. Part 3. First warning signs. The shift started so gradually that I almost missed it entirely. It began around our second anniversary, when David received a significant promotion at his law firm that came with a substantial salary increase and a corner office downtown. The promotion was well-deserved. David had been putting in 12-hour days and winning cases that other lawyers had written off as impossible. His dedication to both his paying clients and his pro bono work had earned him respect throughout Austin's legal community. I was incredibly proud of his success, but the promotion changed our financial situation dramatically. Suddenly, we were in a completely different income bracket, one that put us firmly in Austin's upper middle class. David handled the transition gracefully, as he handled everything. He increased his contributions to various charities, started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, and insisted on finally taking me on the European honeymoon we'd postponed when we bought the house. The trip to Ireland and Scotland was incredible. 2 weeks of exploring castles and countryside, staying in charming bed and breakfasts, and tracing my family's roots back to County Cork. David had secretly learned some basic Irish phrases and had researched Thompson family history, surprising me with visits to villages where my ancestors had lived. We took hundreds of photos and collected stories to share with my parents, who were thrilled that we'd honored our Irish heritage in such a meaningful way. But when we returned home and shared our travel stories with my family, I noticed a subtle shift in the way Marcus looked at David, and more importantly in the way Jessica looked at both of us. The photos of our luxury accommodations, the stories about expensive dinners and private tours, the obvious quality of the souvenirs we'd brought back, it all seemed to create a distance that hadn't existed before. Jessica, in particular, became increasingly focused on our lifestyle changes. When we invited the family over to our house for dinner, she spent the evening commenting on our new furniture, our upgraded kitchen appliances, the art we'd purchased during our travels. "This must have cost a fortune," she'd say, running her fingers along the marble countertop we'd installed. "I guess lawyers really do make good money." Her tone was always just shy of accusatory, but the implication was clear. Marcus started making comments too, but his were different from Jessica's materially focused observations. His remarks were more personal, more cutting. When David would share a story about a case he'd won or a client he'd helped, Marcus would roll his eyes and mutter something about how easy life must be when you get paid to talk for a living. When I'd mention a teaching conference I'd attended or a new program I was implementing at school, Marcus would dismiss it with comments about how teachers got too much time off and didn't understand what real work looked like. The comments stung because they came from my little brother, the person I'd always protected and supported throughout our childhood. Marcus had been the one I'd helped with homework, the one I'd defended when he got in trouble, the one I cheered for at every football game and wrestling match. To see him looking at me with what increasingly felt like resentment was confusing and heartbreaking. I tried to talk to Emma about what I was observing, during one of our sister phone calls that had become a weekly tradition. Emma listened carefully to my concerns, then sighed deeply before responding. "I've been worried about this," she admitted. "Marcus has always been competitive, but it's gotten worse since you married David. I think he feels like you've moved beyond the family somehow, like you're not one of us anymore." The conversation with Emma helped me understand what was happening, but it didn't make it hurt any less. The idea that success and happiness could somehow separate me from my family was foreign to me. When good things happened to people I loved, I celebrated with them. When Emma got promoted to supervisor at the social services office, I was thrilled. When Marcus's construction crew landed a big contract, I bragged about it to my teacher friends. I couldn't understand why my happiness seemed to be threatening to them. David noticed the family tension long before I was ready to acknowledge it fully. He had a lawyer's eye for reading people and situations, and he could see the undercurrents that I was still trying to ignore. One evening, after a particularly uncomfortable family dinner where Jessica had spent the entire meal making pointed comments about our recent kitchen renovation, David brought up his concerns. "Sarah," he said gently as we were getting ready for bed, "I think we need to talk about what's happening with Marcus and Jessica." I tried to brush off his concerns, explaining that Jessica had always been a little materialistic and that Marcus was just going through a stressful period with his business. But David persisted, presenting his observations with the same methodical approach he used in legal arguments. He pointed out specific incidents I'd dismissed or rationalized. The way Marcus's jaw tightened whenever David mentioned work or travel. The way Jessica asked probing questions about our finances and then made comments designed to make others feel inadequate. The way both of them seemed to enjoy moments when David or I looked uncomfortable or when family conversations turned tense. "I'm not trying to cause problems," David assured me, taking my hands in his. "I love your family, and I want us all to get along. But I also love you, and I can see that their behavior is starting to affect you. You've been quieter at family gatherings, more careful about what you say and share. That's not like you, and it's not fair to you." Looking back, David was absolutely right, but at the time, his observations felt like an attack on my family. I'd spent my entire life being the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained harmony. The idea that I might need to confront this growing tension, rather than just endure it and hope it would pass, went against every instinct I'd developed over 30 years of family dynamics. The situation came to a head during Mom's 60th birthday celebration. David and I had offered to host the party at our house, thinking it would be a nice way to show our appreciation for everything Mom had done for our family over the years. We spent weeks planning the perfect celebration, coordinating with Emma to make sure all of Mom's favorite people could attend, ordering a custom cake from her favorite bakery, even hiring a photographer to capture the memories. The party itself was beautiful. Mom was radiant, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, laughing at Dad's terrible jokes and opening thoughtful gifts from everyone. David had surprised her with a professionally bound photo album containing pictures from our Ireland trip, focusing on the locations connected to our family history. Mom cried when she saw it, telling David that it was the most meaningful gift she'd ever received, but throughout the evening, I could feel Jessica's eyes on everything. She commented on the cost of the catering, the expense of the photographer, the extravagance of hiring people to handle details that family members could have managed ourselves. When Mom opened our gift and became emotional, Jessica muttered something about how some people always had to be the stars of the show. Marcus was quieter than usual, but his silence felt loaded with judgment. When Dad pulled David aside to thank him privately for making the evening so special for Mom, I saw Marcus watching with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't just jealousy, it was something darker, more resentful. For the first time, I wondered if my little brother actually disliked my husband. The evening ended with family photos, and looking at them later, I could see the fault lines that were developing. David and I looked happy and relaxed, genuinely enjoying the celebration. Emma and her family seemed comfortable and content, but Marcus and Jessica looked stiff and forced, like they were enduring the party rather than enjoying it. Mom and Dad seemed oblivious to the underlying tension, just grateful that all their children were together for this milestone celebration. A few days after the party, Jessica called me directly, which was unusual since she typically communicated through Marcus or through family group texts. She started the conversation by thanking me for hosting such a lovely celebration for Mom, but then quickly shifted to what seemed to be her real purpose for calling. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said, and I could hear the false sweetness in her voice. But Marcus and I have been wondering about your financial situation. I mean the house renovations, the expensive trips, the lavish parties. We're just concerned that maybe you're getting in over your heads, financially speaking." The question was so presumptuous and inappropriate that I was speechless for a moment. When I finally found my voice, I explained that David and I were financially responsible, and that our spending was well within our means. I tried to keep my tone light and informative, not wanting to create family drama over what I hoped was just misguided concern. But Jessica wasn't satisfied with my reassurances. She continued probing, asking about David's salary, our mortgage payments, whether we had adequate savings for emergencies. When I politely declined to share those personal details, she shifted tactics and began expressing worry about how our lifestyle might be affecting our relationship with the rest of the family. "It just seems like you've gotten so fancy lately," she said, and now the sweetness was completely gone from her voice. "Like maybe you think you're better than the rest of us now. Marcus is really hurt that you never ask him to help with house projects anymore. He feels like you don't think his work is good enough for your new standards." That accusation hit me like a physical blow. The truth was, David enjoyed doing home improvement projects together, and we'd fallen into a routine of handling most repairs and renovations ourselves, or hiring professionals when the work was beyond our skill level. It had never occurred to me that Marcus might interpret this as a rejection of his abilities, or an indication that I thought his work wasn't good enough. I tried to explain this to Jessica, but she seemed determined to find fault with every explanation I offered. When I mentioned that David and I enjoyed working on projects together, she suggested that I was being controlled by my husband and losing my independence. When I explained that we sometimes hired professionals for complex work like electrical or plumbing, she accused me of wasting money on services that family members could provide. The conversation ended with Jessica saying that she and Marcus were worried about me, and that they hoped I'd remember where I came from and not let success change who I was at heart. The implication that I was somehow betraying my roots or abandoning my family values was so unfair and hurtful that I spent the rest of the evening crying. When David came home from work and found me upset, I tried to downplay the conversation, but he could see through my attempts to minimize what had happened. He listened to the entire story without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I described Jessica's questions and accusations. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Sarah," he said finally, "that conversation was completely inappropriate. Jessica had no right to question our finances or to suggest that you've changed in negative ways. And using Marcus's feelings as a weapon to make you feel guilty was manipulative and cruel." I wanted to defend Jessica, to find some way to explain away her behavior, but David's assessment rang true in a way that I couldn't ignore. The conversation had felt wrong while it was happening, but I'd been so conditioned to avoid family conflict that I'd tried to accommodate Jessica's concerns rather than standing up for myself and my marriage. "What do you think I should do?" I asked David, genuinely unsure how to handle this new dynamic. David suggested that we needed to set some boundaries, to make it clear that our personal finances and lifestyle choices were not open for family discussion or judgment. He also recommended that we be more intentional about including Marcus in appropriate ways, while still maintaining our independence as a couple. The next family gathering was tense in a way that previous ones hadn't been. Everyone was polite on the surface, but there were undercurrents of strain that made conversation feel forced and artificial. Marcus seemed to be testing boundaries, making comments that walked right up to the line of disrespect without quite crossing it. Jessica watched everything with sharp eyes, clearly looking for ammunition for future criticisms. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of everything David and I said or did, worried that it might be interpreted as showing off or acting superior. When David complimented Mom's cooking, I wondered if Jessica would see it as condescending. When we mentioned a concert we'd attended, I worried that it sounded pretentious. The spontaneous joy I'd always felt at family gatherings was being replaced by anxiety and self-consciousness. Emma noticed the change in family dynamics during her next visit. She pulled me aside privately and asked what was going on between Marcus and me. When I explained about Jessica's phone call and the growing tension, Emma shook her head in frustration. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "Marcus has always been jealous when other people succeed. but I hoped he'd outgrow it. And Jessica is just making it worse by feeding into his resentment instead of helping him deal with it maturely. Emma's perspective was enlightening, but also discouraging. If Marcus's behavior was part of a long-standing pattern, rather than a temporary reaction to our changed circumstances, then it was unlikely to improve on its own. The little brother I'd always adored and protected might be developing into someone I didn't recognize or particularly like. Part 4. Relationship Development and Success. Despite the growing tension with Marcus and Jessica, David and I continued to thrive as a couple and as individuals. Our third year of marriage brought new opportunities and adventures that strengthened our bond even further. David was offered a partnership track at his law firm, a recognition of his exceptional work and his growing reputation in Austin's legal community. The offer came with increased responsibilities, higher compensation, and the chance to build his own practice within the established firm. I was equally successful in my own career. The school district selected me to lead a new initiative focused on integrating technology into elementary education. The program involved working with teachers across 12 schools, training them on innovative teaching methods, and helping them implement new curriculum standards. It was challenging work that required me to travel between schools, lead professional development workshops, and collaborate with administrators at the district level. The recognition felt incredible. For the first time in my career, I was seen as an expert in my field, someone whose opinion mattered beyond the walls of my individual classroom. My salary increased significantly to reflect the expanded responsibilities, and suddenly I was contributing much more substantially to our household income. David was absolutely thrilled about my success, celebrating each milestone as enthusiastically as if it were his own achievement. Our evenings became rich with conversation about our respective work challenges and successes. David would share stories about complex cases he was building, asking for my perspective on jury psychology or communication strategies. I would describe the teachers I was working with, their resistance to change, their breakthrough moments, their innovative ideas. We became each other's most trusted advisors, offering insights that came from our different but complementary professional experiences. The financial security that came with both of our career advances allowed us to dream bigger about our future together. We started seriously discussing children, moving from abstract conversations about someday having kids to concrete planning about timing and preparation. David suggested that we should buy a bigger house with a proper yard and room for a growing family. I wanted to finish the technology integration program and establish myself fully in the district leadership before taking maternity leave. We began house hunting in Austin's most desirable neighborhoods, looking at properties with excellent schools and safe streets where children could ride bikes and play outside. David had specific requirements based on his own childhood memories of the home his parents had provided. He wanted a front porch where we could sit in the evenings, a kitchen large enough for family gatherings, and bedrooms positioned so that parents could hear children if they needed help at night. My requirements were more focused on the practical aspects of managing a household while working full-time. I wanted a mudroom where school bags and sports equipment could be organized, a home office where I could work on curriculum development, an outdoor space where children could explore and learn about nature. Together, we created a vision of the home where we wanted to raise our family. The house we eventually found exceeded both of our wish lists. It was a craftsman-style home in Travis Heights, one of Austin's most established neighborhoods. The house had been built in the 1920s, but had been carefully renovated by previous owners who respected its historical character while updating the systems and layout for modern living. It had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a spacious kitchen with a breakfast nook, and a backyard with mature oak trees and room for a vegetable garden. The purchasing process was smooth because of David's legal expertise and our strong financial position. We were able to make a competitive offer quickly and navigate the inspection and closing process without the stress that often accompanies home buying. When we got the keys to our new house, we spent the entire first evening walking through the rooms and imagining how we'd make each space our own. David's law firm colleagues were impressed by our new address and frequently commented on how well we were doing for such a young couple. My teaching friends were equally supportive, excited about the proximity to some of Austin's best schools, and the potential for hosting district meetings and professional development workshops in our spacious home. Everyone seemed to recognize that we were building something substantial and meaningful together. The move itself was surprisingly emotional. As we packed up the townhouse where we'd started our married life together, I found myself nostalgic for the simplicity of those early days. David noticed my melancholy and suggested that we take photos of each room before the movers arrived, creating a visual record of our first home together. "This house taught us how to be married," he said, looking around the empty living room. "We'll always be grateful for what we learned here." Our new house required more furniture and decoration, which gave us a perfect project to work on together. We spent weekends antiquing and visiting furniture stores, looking for pieces that reflected both of our tastes and the character of the house. David had developed an appreciation for craftsmanship and quality, preferring to buy fewer pieces that would last for decades rather than filling the house quickly with temporary solutions. I focused on creating spaces that felt warm and welcoming, choosing colors and textures that would make the house feel like a true home rather than a showplace. We painted the walls in rich, saturated colors that complemented the house's original hardwood floors and architectural details. The result was a home that felt both sophisticated and comfortable, a place where we could entertain friends formally or spend quiet evenings reading by the fireplace. The housewarming party we threw that fall was one of the most successful events we'd ever hosted. We invited everyone who mattered to us, from David's law firm partners to my teaching colleagues to longtime friends from college. The house felt alive with laughter and conversation, and several guests commented on how perfectly the space reflected both of our personalities. My family's reaction to the new house was more complicated. Mom and Dad were clearly proud that we'd achieved such obvious success, but they seemed almost intimidated by the elegance of our new surroundings. Mom kept commenting on how clean everything was, and worrying about whether she should remove her shoes when she walked on our hardwood floors. Dad spent most of his visit examining the craftsmanship of the renovation work, clearly impressed but also somewhat overwhelmed by the quality and expense involved. Emma was thrilled for us and immediately started planning visits where her boys could enjoy our spacious backyard and the nearby parks. She understood intuitively that our success didn't change our fundamental relationships or our commitment to family. When she saw how happy David and I were in our new environment, she was genuinely excited for our future and the possibilities it represented. Marcus and Jessica's reaction was predictably more negative. They toured the house with what seemed like a mixture of admiration and resentment, commenting on details in ways that felt more like criticism than compliments. Jessica spent considerable time asking about costs and financing, questions that felt invasive and inappropriate given that we'd never asked them about their own financial decisions. The tension came to a head during Christmas dinner at our new house. We'd volunteered to host the extended family gathering, thinking it would be a nice way to share our good fortune and create new traditions in our beautiful home. David and I spent weeks preparing, researching recipes, and planning decorations that would make the celebration special for everyone. The dinner itself was delicious, and most of the family seemed to genuinely enjoy the experience of celebrating in such lovely surroundings. My parents were proud to have their friends and extended family see how well their daughter was doing. Emma's boys were delighted with the space to run around and the elaborate decorations we'd installed throughout the house. But Marcus seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. He made several comments about how different everything felt from the Christmases we'd celebrated growing up. When Dad gave a toast thanking David and me for our hospitality, Marcus's expression was openly resentful. Jessica spent the evening taking photos of everything, but in a way that felt more like documenting evidence than celebrating memories. The evening ended with Marcus confronting me privately in the kitchen while I was cleaning up. "You've really changed," he said, and his tone was accusatory rather than conversational. "This house, this whole lifestyle, it's like you're trying to prove something to the rest of us." I tried to explain that we'd simply been fortunate in our careers and that we wanted to share our good fortune with family, but Marcus wasn't interested in my explanations. "Jessica's right," he continued. "You think you're better than us now. You think because you married some hotshot lawyer and live in this fancy house, you're not a Thompson anymore." The accusation was so unfair and hurtful that I started crying, which only seemed to make Marcus angrier. "Don't give me the tears," he said. You made your choice when you decided to leave the rest of us behind. David walked into the kitchen at that moment and immediately sensed the tension. He looked between Marcus and me, taking in my tears and Marcus's hostile posture, and his expression hardened in a way I'd never seen before. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, and his voice had the controlled authority he used in courtroom situations. Marcus seemed to realize that he'd crossed a line, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down on his accusations. "Just talking to my sister about how much she's changed since she got married," he said, clearly trying to provoke David into some kind of reaction. David didn't take the bait, but he moved closer to me, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. "I think maybe it's time for everyone to head home," David said calmly. "It's been a long day, and people are getting tired." His tone was polite but firm, clearly indicating that the conversation was over. Marcus stared at him for a moment, then stalked out of the kitchen without saying goodbye to either of us. That night, as David and I finished cleaning up from what should have been a joyful family celebration, I felt like something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Marcus. The little brother, who had once been my closest ally in the family, had become someone who actively resented my happiness and success. The realization was heartbreaking, but it was also clarifying in a way that helped me understand the dynamics that had been building for months. "I'm sorry that happened," David said as we finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs. "Marcus was completely out of line, and you didn't deserve any of what he said." I leaned against David's shoulder, grateful for his steady presence and his unwavering support. Whatever challenges lay ahead with my family, I knew that my husband would always be on my side, always ready to protect and defend our marriage and our life together. Part 5, External Validation. The professional recognition that both David and I received during our 4th year of marriage brought external validation that somehow made the family tensions even more pronounced. David was featured in Austin Monthly magazine as one of the city's rising legal stars, highlighted for his work on high-profile corporate cases and his extensive pro bono contributions to education law. The article included a photo of both of us at a charity fundraiser, describing me as an innovative educator who was transforming elementary teaching in the Austin area. The recognition felt surreal. Growing up, I'd never imagined that people outside my immediate circle would know or care about my work. But suddenly I was being invited to speak at national education conferences, consulted by curriculum companies developing new teaching materials, and approached by other school districts interested in implementing similar technology integration programs. My expertise was valued far beyond Austin, and the validation was both thrilling and intimidating. David's success was even more dramatic. The partnership he'd been offered became official, making him one of the youngest partners in his firm's history. His office moved to the prestigious top floor, and his name was added to the letterhead alongside lawyers who had been practicing for decades. The local legal community took notice, and David began receiving invitations to serve on nonprofit boards and speak at professional conferences across Texas. Our social circle expanded to include some of Austin's most influential and accomplished people. We attended charity galas, where we sat at tables with city council members and successful entrepreneurs. We were invited to private art gallery openings and exclusive restaurant launches. David and I often looked at each other across crowded rooms at these events, amazed that our lives had taken such an unexpected turn. The attention wasn't always comfortable for me. I'd grown up in a family where calling attention to yourself was discouraged, where modesty and humility were valued above recognition and achievement. Being photographed for magazine articles and introduced as an expert in my field felt foreign and sometimes overwhelming, but David helped me navigate these new experiences with grace and confidence. "You've earned every bit of recognition you're receiving," he'd remind me when I felt uncomfortable with praise or attention. "You're genuinely making a difference in children's lives, and people should know about the innovative work you're doing." His belief in me was so complete and unwavering that it helped me believe in myself and accept that my work truly was valuable and noteworthy. The financial rewards that came with our professional success allowed us to be more generous with our families and our community. We established a scholarship fund at our respective alma maters, contributed significantly to our church's building campaign, and became regular donors to several local charities focused on education and children's welfare. David insisted that success came with responsibility to help others, and we tried to use our resources to make a positive impact beyond our own lives. My parents were proud of our achievements, but their pride was mixed with a kind of bewilderment that their middle daughter had somehow achieved such prominence. Mom would clip articles about us from local magazines and newspapers, creating a scrapbook that she'd show to neighbors and friends. Dad would mention David's legal successes to customers at the auto shop, clearly pleased to be associated with such an accomplished son-in-law. But their pride was also tinged with concern about whether we were getting too big for our britches, as Mom would say. They worried that success might change us in negative ways, that we might forget our humble origins, or start looking down on people who hadn't achieved similar recognition. These concerns were expressed indirectly, through comments about the importance of staying grounded and remembering where we came from. Emma was unequivocally thrilled about our success and completely comfortable with the changes it brought to our lives. As a social worker, she understood the value of using privilege and resources to help others, and she was proud of the charitable work David and I were doing. She also appreciated how our success reflected positively on the entire Thompson family, opening doors and creating opportunities that benefited everyone. "You're showing the boys what's possible," she told me during one of our phone conversations, referring to her two sons. "They see that hard work and education really can change your life. That's worth more than any amount of money." Emma's boys had indeed begun asking more questions about college and careers, inspired by seeing their aunt and uncle achieve such obvious success through dedication and smart choices. The external validation we received seemed to highlight the growing divide within my immediate family. While most people celebrated our achievements, Marcus and Jessica appeared to become more resentful with each accolade and recognition. When David's partnership was announced in the Austin Business Journal, Jessica called me with congratulations that felt forced and hollow. "Must be nice to have everything handed to you," she said, and though she tried to make it sound like a joke, the underlying bitterness was unmistakable. Marcus's reaction was even more troubling. Instead of acknowledging David's hard work and talent, he began making comments about how lawyers were parasites who got rich off other people's problems. When I tried to explain the valuable work David did, particularly his pro bono cases helping families navigate the legal system, Marcus would wave off my explanations with dismissive gestures and comments about how easy it was to look good when you were already making plenty of money. The resentment began affecting family gatherings in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Marcus would arrive at family dinners with a chip on his shoulder, ready to take offense at anything David or I said about our work or our lives. Jessica would make pointed comments about our clothes, our car, our vacation plans, anything that reminded everyone of our changed financial circumstances. The easy warmth that had always characterized Thompson family gatherings was being replaced by an undercurrent of tension that no one knew how to address. Dad tried to smooth things over by changing the subject whenever conversations became uncomfortable, but his efforts only highlighted how problematic the dynamics had become. Mom would make nervous jokes about having such successful children, but her discomfort was obvious. Emma started visiting less frequently, explaining privately that she didn't want to subject her boys to the negative atmosphere that Marcus and Jessica were creating. The situation reached a breaking point during a family celebration for Dad's 62nd birthday. We'd planned a surprise party at the family's favorite restaurant, Miguel's Mexican Food, where we'd been going for special occasions since I was a child. David and I had offered to pay for the entire dinner, wanting to make the celebration special for Dad, who had always worked so hard to provide for our family. The evening started well, with Dad genuinely surprised and delighted by the gathering of family and close friends. He was touched by the thoughtfulness of having the party at Miguel's, and he seemed to enjoy being the center of attention for once. The restaurant had prepared Dad's favorite dishes, and the owner, Miguel himself, came to our table to wish Dad a happy birthday and share stories about watching our family grow up over the years. But, as the evening progressed, Marcus began making increasingly pointed comments about the expense of the celebration. He questioned whether it was necessary to order so much food, whether Dad really needed such an elaborate cake, whether the whole thing wasn't just an excuse for David and me to show off our wealth. His comments were loud enough for other diners to hear, and I could see Dad becoming uncomfortable with the attention Marcus was drawing to our table. Jessica joined in with her own observations about how different our family celebrations had become since David and I got married. She reminisced about simpler birthday parties from our childhood, making it clear that she thought those celebrations had been more authentic and meaningful than the current gathering. Her comments were designed to make everyone feel like David and I had somehow corrupted the family's traditions with our newfound affluence. David remained calm throughout Marcus and Jessica's passive-aggressive attacks, responding to their comments with polite acknowledgments and then steering the conversation back to Dad and the purpose of the celebration. His restraint was admirable, but I could see the tension in his jaw and the way his hand tightened around his water glass. He was controlling his temper, but it was costing him considerable effort. The final straw came when Marcus stood up to give a toast to Dad. What started as a loving tribute to our father quickly turned into a thinly veiled attack on David and me. Marcus spoke about how Dad had taught us the value of hard work and staying humble, how he'd shown us that success meant being able to take care of your family without losing sight of what really mattered. Then he looked directly at David and me and said, "Some of us remember those lessons better than others." The restaurant fell silent, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment and anger. Dad looked stricken, clearly realizing that his birthday celebration had become a platform for Marcus to air his grievances about my marriage and our lifestyle. Mom's eyes filled with tears, and Emma reached under the table to squeeze my hand in support. David stood up slowly, his expression calm but his voice carrying an authority that commanded attention. "I'd like to propose a toast as well," he said, raising his glass. "To Robert Thompson, a man who built a successful business through integrity and hard work, who raised 3 children to be productive members of society, and who taught his family that success should be celebrated, not resented. Happy birthday, Dad." The toast was perfect, acknowledging Dad's achievements while subtly rebuking Marcus's bitter comments. Other people at nearby tables actually applauded, and Dad's face lit up with pride and gratitude. But Marcus's expression darkened, and I could see that David's response had only made him angrier. The drive home from the restaurant was tense. David didn't say much, but I could tell he was processing what had happened and what it meant for our relationship with my family. When we got home, he finally expressed his frustration. "I don't understand what Marcus wants from us," he said. "Are we supposed to apologize for being successful? Are we supposed to hide our achievements to make him feel better about his own choices?" I tried to defend Marcus, explaining that he'd always been sensitive about competition, and that he was probably feeling insecure about his own financial struggles. But even as I spoke the words, I realized how tired I was of making excuses for my brother's behavior. David had done nothing but support our family, treat everyone with respect, and contribute generously to family celebrations. Marcus's resentment was unfair and increasingly difficult to tolerate. The external validation we continued to receive only seemed to make the family situation worse. When I was selected to serve on the state education committee developing new curriculum standards, Marcus's reaction was to question whether I was qualified for such responsibility. When David was invited to speak at a legal conference in Dallas, Jessica made snide comments about how lawyers love to hear themselves talk. Their negativity began affecting other aspects of our family relationships. My parents started seeming uncomfortable when David and I shared good news, as if they were worried about how Marcus and Jessica would react. Emma began calling me separately to get updates on our lives, explaining that she didn't want to create awkwardness by asking questions about our work or achievements at family gatherings. This situation was particularly frustrating, because David and I had always been generous about sharing our good fortune with family. We'd paid for family vacations, contributed to home repairs when my parents needed help, and always picked up the check at restaurants. We'd given thoughtful, expensive gifts for birthdays and holidays, helped with my nephew's educational expenses, and made ourselves available whenever anyone needed legal advice or professional guidance. But instead of appreciation, our generosity seemed to generate more resentment. Marcus began making comments about how we were trying to buy family loyalty or make everyone feel indebted to us. Jessica suggested that our gifts came with strings attached, that we expected special treatment in return for our financial contributions. Their interpretations of our motives were so far from our actual intentions that I began to wonder if they really knew us at all. The professional recognition we received also brought us into contact with other successful couples who were dealing with similar family dynamics. At charity events and professional gatherings, we met people who shared stories about relatives who resented their success, friends who became jealous and distant, and family members who seemed unable to celebrate achievements without feeling diminished themselves. These conversations were both comforting and discouraging. It was reassuring to know that we weren't alone in dealing with family resentment over professional success, but it was disheartening to realize how common the problem was. Several people suggested that we might need to limit our contact with family members who couldn't be supportive. But the idea of reducing our involvement with my parents and siblings felt like giving up on relationships that had been central to my identity for my entire life. David suggested that we try family counseling, but when I brought up the idea with Emma, she laughed bitterly. "Good luck getting Marcus and Jessica to admit they need help," she said. "They think everyone else is the problem." Emma's assessment was probably accurate, but it left us without obvious solutions for improving the family dynamics. The stress of managing family relationships while maintaining our professional responsibilities began taking a toll on both David and me. I found myself dreading family gatherings and making excuses to avoid events where Marcus and Jessica would be present. David started working longer hours, partly because of his increased responsibilities as a partner, but also because home had become associated with family stress and conflict. Our marriage remained strong throughout this difficult period, but the family situation was definitely affecting our happiness and peace of mind. We built a beautiful life together, achieved professional success beyond our wildest dreams, and created financial security that allowed us to be generous with others. But instead of feeling proud and grateful for our accomplishments, we often felt defensive and exhausted from constantly having to justify our success to people who should have been celebrating with us. The recognition we received from our professional communities served as a reminder that our work was valuable and our achievements were legitimate. When colleagues and clients praised our contributions, when professional organizations honored our service, when media outlets featured our successes, it validated our efforts and reminded us that we had nothing to apologize for. The contrast between the support we received from our professional communities and the resentment we faced from my family was stark and increasingly difficult to ignore. As we entered our 5th year of marriage, David and I began seriously discussing whether we needed to set firmer boundaries with Marcus and Jessica. Their behavior was affecting not just our own happiness, but also the comfort and enjoyment of other family members. My parents shouldn't have to worry about family gatherings becoming battlegrounds, and Emma's children shouldn't be exposed to the negative dynamics that Marcus and Jessica were creating. The decision about how to handle the situation was complicated by my deep love for my parents and my desire to maintain close relationships with them. Cutting ties with Marcus and Jessica might also mean seeing less of Mom and Dad, since family gatherings would become even more difficult if there were open conflicts or if people were forced to choose sides. The prospect of losing regular contact with my parents was heartbreaking, but continuing to endure Marcus and Jessica's hostility was becoming increasingly unbearable. David, as always, was supportive of whatever decision I wanted to make about my family relationships. He never pressured me to cut ties with Marcus and Jessica, but he also made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate much more disrespect directed at either of us. His patience had limits, and I could see that we were approaching those limits with each family gathering that ended in tension and hurt feelings. The external validation of our professional achievements had given us confidence in our abilities and our value as individuals and as a couple. We knew that we were making positive contributions to our community, that we were using our resources responsibly, and that we were building a life together that reflected our values and priorities. The recognition from our peers confirmed that our efforts were worthwhile and our success was well-deserved. But the family situation remained a source of pain and frustration that overshadowed many of our professional triumphs. No amount of external recognition could compensate for the loss of family support and understanding. The people who should have been proudest of our achievements were instead the source of our greatest interpersonal stress, and that contradiction was becoming increasingly difficult to live with. As spring turned to summer, and we began planning for another 4th of July celebration, I had no idea that the family tensions that had been building for years were about to explode in a way that would change everything forever. The external validation we'd received had given us strength and confidence, but it had also made Marcus and Jessica's resentment more intense and more dangerous. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything David and I had built together, and that would ultimately reveal who our true family really was. The inheritance situation that would ultimately destroy my relationship with Marcus began 6 months before that terrible 4th of July, when my grandmother Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87. Grandma Thompson had been the matriarch of our family, a tough Irish woman who had immigrated to Texas as a young bride and had spent 70 years building a life of dignity and modest prosperity through sheer determination and careful saving. She had lived independently in her small house in East Austin until the very end, tending her garden and managing her finances with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her entire life. Grandma Thompson had always been fair with her grandchildren, treating Emma, Marcus, and me with equal affection and equal expectations. She had helped all of us with college expenses, attended every graduation and wedding, and had been a source of wisdom and stability throughout our childhood. When the lawyer read Grandma Thompson's will at his downtown office, the contents were straightforward and, I thought, completely fair. She had left her house and her savings, totaling about $150,000, to be divided equally among her 3 grandchildren. The house needed some work, but it was in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying, making it worth considerably more than its assessed value. The cash portion of the inheritance would give each of us $50,000, a significant sum that could make a real difference in all of our lives. I was grateful for Grandma Thompson's generosity, but I wasn't financially dependent on the inheritance the way Marcus apparently was. David and I were doing well enough that the money felt like a wonderful bonus rather than a necessity. We talked about using my portion to start a college fund for the children we planned to have, or perhaps to make a substantial donation to the education foundation we supported. Marcus's reaction to the will was immediate and explosive. He stormed out of the lawyer's office before the meeting was finished, muttering something about how the will didn't reflect Grandma Thompson's real intentions. Jessica followed him, shooting accusatory looks at Emma and me as if we had somehow manipulated an elderly woman into changing her final wishes. The lawyer seemed surprised by their reaction, explaining that the will had been prepared 2 years earlier, and that Grandma Thompson had been completely lucid and decisive about her wishes. Over the following weeks, Marcus's resentment about the inheritance grew rather than diminished. He began calling family members, trying to build support for the idea that the will was unfair and should be contested. His argument was that as the only grandson and the person who would carry on the Thompson name, he deserved a larger share of the inheritance. He also claimed that Grandma Thompson had always intended for him to have the house, since he was the one who had helped with yard work and maintenance over the years. Jessica supported Marcus's position enthusiastically, adding her own arguments about how the equal division didn't reflect the different needs of the 3 grandchildren. She pointed out that Marcus was trying to build a construction business and could use the additional capital for equipment and expansion. She suggested that Emma and I, both married to successful men, didn't really need the money the way Marcus did. The arguments were so fundamentally flawed and selfish that I was shocked Marcus was making them seriously. Grandma Thompson had been clear about her wishes, and she had every right to distribute her assets as she saw fit. The fact that Marcus felt entitled to more than his fair share revealed a side of his character that I had never seen before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. Emma was equally appalled by Marcus's behavior. During one of our phone conversations, she expressed her frustration with his sense of entitlement and his willingness to create family conflict over money. "He's showing his true colors," she said. "Grandma Thompson would be heartbroken to see him acting this way. She always treated us all equally, and she expected us to treat each other equally too." Dad tried to stay neutral in the inheritance dispute, but his discomfort with the situation was obvious. He had loved his mother deeply and respected her judgment in all things. The idea that one of his children would question her final wishes was painful for him, but he also didn't want to take sides in a conflict between his children. Mom was more direct in her disapproval of Marcus's behavior, pointing out that Grandma Thompson had been mentally sharp until the end, and had certainly known what she was doing when she made her will. The inheritance dispute created a divide in the family that affected every interaction. Marcus and Jessica stopped attending family gatherings, claiming they were too upset about the unfair treatment to pretend everything was normal. When they did show up, they spent the time trying to convince other family members that the will should be challenged, and that Emma and I should voluntarily give up portions of our inheritance to make things fair. Their campaign was unsuccessful with most of the family, but it created an atmosphere of tension and conflict that made everyone uncomfortable. My parents' house, which had always been a place of warmth and welcome, became a battleground where every conversation could potentially turn into an argument about the inheritance. Emma started avoiding family gatherings altogether, explaining that she didn't want to subject her children to the negativity. David observed the family dynamics with growing concern and frustration. As a lawyer, he understood exactly how inheritance disputes could tear families apart, and he could see that Marcus's behavior was escalating rather than diminishing over time. He offered to help mediate the situation or to provide legal advice about how to handle Marcus's threats to contest the will, but I was still hoping that the situation would resolve itself without legal intervention. The breaking point in the inheritance dispute came when Marcus hired a lawyer to formally challenge Grandma Thompson's will. The legal documents he filed claimed that our grandmother had been unduly influenced by Emma and me, and that her true intention had been to leave the bulk of her estate to her only male heir. The claims were baseless and insulting, suggesting that Emma and I had somehow manipulated a woman who had been fiercely independent until the day she died. When David saw the legal papers that Marcus had filed, his expression changed in a way that told me everything I needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. "This is more than just family drama now," he said, studying the documents carefully. "Marcus is making legal claims that could drag this process out for years and cost everyone a significant amount of money in legal fees. He's also making accusations about you and Emma that are serious and potentially damaging." The realization that my little brother was willing to destroy our family relationships and our grandmother's reputation in pursuit of money he wasn't entitled to was devastating. I had always known that Marcus could be selfish and impulsive, but I had never imagined he was capable of such calculated cruelty. The brother I had protected and supported throughout our childhood was now actively trying to harm me in the most public and humiliating way possible. David recommended that Emma and I hire our own attorney to defend against Marcus's claims and to protect our interests in the estate. The lawyer he recommended was experienced in estate disputes and assured us that Marcus's claims were unlikely to succeed, but warned that the process could be expensive and emotionally draining. The fact that defending our grandmother's clearly expressed wishes would cost us thousands of dollars in legal fees was infuriating but necessary. As the legal battle over the inheritance began, Marcus and Jessica's hostility toward David and me intensified. They seemed to blame us not just for refusing to give up our rightful inheritance, but for having the resources to fight their legal challenge effectively. Jessica made comments about how unfair it was that we could afford better lawyers, as if our professional success somehow gave us an unethical advantage in defending our grandmother's wishes. The strain of the inheritance dispute began affecting every aspect of our family relationships. My parents were caught in the middle, torn between their love for all their children and their belief that Grandma Thompson's will should be respected. They tried to remain neutral, but their disappointment in Marcus was obvious, and their worry about the family being torn apart was heartbreaking to witness. Emma handled the situation with characteristic strength and clarity, but the stress was taking a toll on her as well. She was dealing with her own demanding job and raising 2 young children while trying to manage the emotional and legal complexities of the inheritance dispute. The fact that she had to hire a lawyer and spend money defending her right to an inheritance that was legally and morally hers was deeply unfair. The inheritance battle reached its peak during the spring before the 4th of July gathering that would change everything. Marcus's lawyer had been making increasingly aggressive demands, threatening to drag the case out for years if we didn't agree to a settlement that would give Marcus a larger share of the estate. The legal costs were mounting for all parties involved, and the emotional toll on the family was becoming unbearable. David's patience with the situation was wearing thin, not because of the money involved, but because of the way Marcus's behavior was affecting me and the rest of my family. He had watched me cry after difficult phone calls with my parents, had seen me lose sleep worrying about the family conflict, and had witnessed the way the inheritance dispute was poisoning every family interaction. His protective instincts were fully engaged, and he was becoming less willing to tolerate Marcus's attacks on my character and our marriage. The 4th of July gathering at my parents' house was planned as an attempt to restore some normalcy to family relationships. Mom had begged Marcus and Jessica to attend, hoping that a relaxed, traditional family celebration might help everyone remember what was really important. Dad had suggested that we all agree not to discuss the inheritance dispute during the holiday, focusing instead on enjoying each other's company and celebrating our country's birthday. I was hesitant about attending the gathering, knowing that the unresolved inheritance dispute would create an undercurrent of tension, even if we all tried to avoid the topic. But David encouraged me to go, pointing out that my parents deserved to have their family together for the holiday and that avoiding the gathering would only make the situation worse. He also believed that Marcus might behave better in front of extended family and longtime family friends who would be attending the barbecue. The morning of the 4th of July was brutally hot, even by Texas standards. The temperature was already in the 90s by 10 in the morning, and the weather forecast predicted it would reach over 100 degrees by afternoon. My parents had set up their traditional barbecue setup in the backyard, with folding tables under the big oak tree and coolers full of beer and soft drinks positioned around the patio. Dad had been up since dawn, preparing his famous barbecue rub and getting the smoker ready for the brisket that would be the centerpiece of the meal. David and I arrived at my parents' house around noon, bringing our traditional contribution of homemade potato salad and a watermelon cake that Mom had requested. The backyard was already filling up with family members and longtime family friends, and the atmosphere seemed relaxed and cheerful despite the underlying tensions. My parents were clearly relieved to have everyone together, and they were working hard to make sure the celebration felt normal and enjoyable. Marcus and Jessica arrived about an hour later, and I could immediately sense the tension in their body language and facial expressions. Marcus's jaw was set in the stubborn expression I remembered from childhood, the one that appeared whenever he was determined to prove a point or win an argument. Jessica was wearing a dress that seemed too formal for a backyard barbecue, and her smile looked forced and artificial. The first few hours of the gathering went smoothly, with everyone making an effort to keep conversations light and avoid controversial topics. Marcus and David even had a brief civil conversation about the Austin real estate market, though I could see the strain in both their faces as they worked to maintain polite social interaction. Jessica complimented Mom on the decorations and asked about Dad's barbecue techniques, playing the role of the interested daughter-in-law. But as the afternoon wore on and the heat became more oppressive, the artificial politeness began to crack. Marcus started making pointed comments about people who thought they were too good for family traditions, clearly referring to David and me, even though he didn't mention us by name. Jessica began asking probing questions about our recent vacation to Colorado, focusing on the cost and exclusivity of the resort where we'd stayed. The breaking point came during the traditional family photo session that always concluded our 4th of July gatherings. Dad had set up his camera on a tripod and was trying to organize everyone for the annual group picture that would join decades of similar photos in the family album. As we all gathered under the oak tree, positioning ourselves according to Dad's directions, Marcus suddenly stepped forward and put his hand on my shoulder. "Before we take this picture," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I think there's something that needs to be said." The tone of his voice made everyone freeze, and I could see Dad's face fall as he realized that Marcus was about to create a scene during what should have been a happy family moment. "Marcus," Mom said quickly, "let's just take the picture first, and then we can talk about whatever's on your mind." But Marcus ignored her, his grip on my shoulder tightening as he prepared to say whatever he had been planning all afternoon. "I want everyone here to understand what kind of person my sister really is," Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "Because apparently success and money are more important to her than family loyalty and doing what's right." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence, and I could feel the shocked attention of everyone at the gathering focusing on our family drama. David stepped closer to me, his expression darkening as he recognized that Marcus was launching some kind of public attack. "That's enough," David said firmly, his lawyer's voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't the time or place for whatever grievance you think you have." But Marcus was beyond reason now, months of resentment and entitlement exploding in the Texas heat. "Don't tell me what's enough," he snarled at David. "You've been the problem from the beginning, filling my sister's head with ideas about being better than the rest of us, turning her against her own family. The accusations were so unfair and so divorced from reality that I felt like I'd been slapped. David had always been respectful to my family, generous with his time and resources, and supportive of my relationships with my parents and siblings. The idea that he had somehow corrupted me or turned me against my family was not just wrong, it was cruel." "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. "David has never done anything but support this family and treat everyone with respect. If you have a problem with me, then say it directly instead of attacking my husband." Marcus's face twisted with rage, and suddenly he wasn't my little brother anymore. He was a stranger whose hatred was directed at everything I had built with the man I loved. "You're not even really family anymore," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You chose him over us, chose his money and his fancy lifestyle over your own blood. You're a Thompson in name only." The words hit me like a physical blow, but before I could respond, Marcus drew back his right fist and drove it directly into my face. The punch landed squarely on my jaw with enough force to snap my head back and send me stumbling backward into David's arms. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, radiating from my jaw through my entire skull, and I could taste blood in my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. The silence that followed the punch was absolute and terrifying. Everyone at the gathering stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. My little brother, the person I had loved and protected throughout our childhood, had just physically assaulted me in front of our entire family because I wouldn't give him money he wasn't entitled to. David's reaction was swift and decisive. He made sure I was steady on my feet, then turned to face Marcus with an expression of controlled fury that I had never seen before. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. "You're going to hear from my lawyer, and you're going to pay for every single consequence of what you just did." Marcus seemed to realize immediately that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross, but instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, he doubled down on his aggression. "Go ahead and sue me," he said, though his voice was less confident than it had been moments before. "Everyone here saw that it was barely a tap. You're both just dramatic and soft." That's when my father stepped forward, his face pale with shock and disappointment. "Marcus Thompson," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You get off my property right now. I don't care what your problems are with your sister or your brother-in-law, you don't put your hands on family members in my house." The rest of the family began to react as the initial shock wore off. Emma rushed to my side, examining my swelling jaw and expressing horror at what Marcus had done. Mom was crying, clearly devastated that her family celebration had turned into a scene of violence and hatred. The family friends who had witnessed the assault were backing away, uncomfortable with being present for such a personal and ugly family crisis. Jessica, instead of being horrified by her husband's behavior, began defending his actions and attacking me. "She had it coming," Jessica said, her voice shrill with defensive anger. "She's been acting like she's better than all of us for years, flaunting her money and her perfect life while the rest of us struggle. Someone needed to knock her down a peg." David's legal training kicked in immediately. While I was still processing the shock of being punched by my own brother, David was already documenting the assault and gathering evidence. He took photos of my injuries with his phone, making note of the witnesses who had seen the attack, and began asking people to provide written statements about what they had observed. The police arrived within 20 minutes of David's call, having been summoned to handle an assault complaint. Marcus initially tried to minimize what had happened, claiming that it had been a minor family disagreement that got slightly out of hand. But when the officers saw the swelling on my jaw and heard testimony from multiple witnesses about the unprovoked nature of the attack, they arrested Marcus for assault and took him away in handcuffs. The sight of my little brother being arrested at my parents' 4th of July celebration was surreal and heartbreaking. This was supposed to be a day of family togetherness and patriotic celebration, but instead it had become the day when our family was irreparably broken by greed, resentment, and violence. The brother I had loved and supported for 32 years was being taken away in handcuffs for attacking me, and I knew that our relationship would never recover from this moment. In the weeks that followed, David made good on his promise to pursue every legal remedy available. He filed both criminal charges for assault and a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the physical and emotional harm Marcus had caused. The legal documents were thorough and devastating, presenting a clear case that Marcus had committed an unprovoked assault, motivated by greed and family resentment. The inheritance dispute that had started the whole conflict was resolved quickly once Marcus was facing criminal charges. His lawyer advised him to drop his challenge to Grandma Thompson's will, since his arrest for assaulting one of the other beneficiaries had destroyed any credibility he might have had in court. Emma and I received our rightful inheritances without further legal complications, though the money felt tainted by the family destruction it had caused. Marcus pled guilty to assault charges and received probation, community service, and a requirement to attend anger management counseling. The civil lawsuit resulted in a significant financial judgment against him, money that David and I donated to a domestic violence prevention organization, because we didn't want to profit from the destruction of my family relationships. Looking back now, I realize that the inheritance dispute was never really about money. It was about Marcus's lifelong resentment of anyone whose success made him feel inadequate, his sense of entitlement to things he hadn't earned, and his inability to accept that his choices had consequences. The inheritance just provided a focus for anger and resentment that had been building for years. David's response to the assault showed me exactly what kind of man I had married. While I was still in shock and trying to process what had happened, he was already protecting me, documenting evidence, and making sure that Marcus faced appropriate consequences for his actions. He didn't try to minimize the assault or encourage me to forgive and forget for the sake of family harmony. Instead, he treated the attack as the serious crime it was, and used his legal expertise to ensure that justice was served. The family relationships that survived this crisis were stronger for having weathered it together. My parents eventually came to understand that they had to choose between enabling Marcus's destructive behavior and maintaining relationships with their other children. Emma and I grew closer through the shared experience of dealing with Marcus's legal assault on our inheritance and his physical assault on my person. Today, David and I have the family we chose rather than the family we were born into. We have friends who celebrate our successes rather than resenting them, colleagues who value our contributions rather than minimizing them, and a marriage built on mutual respect and unwavering support. We learned that blood relationships don't automatically deserve loyalty when they become abusive, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is enforce consequences for unacceptable behavior. If you're dealing with family members who resent your success, who feel entitled to what you've earned, or who use emotional manipulation and even violence to get their way, know that you have choices. You can choose to surround yourself with people who lift you up rather than tear you down. You can choose to protect yourself and your marriage rather than enabling destructive behavior. And you can choose to build the life you deserve, regardless of whether your biological family supports your choices. The punch that Marcus threw that 4th of July afternoon was intended to knock me down and put me in my place. Instead, it freed me from toxic relationships that had been holding me back for years. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened, because it forces you to see clearly and choose wisely about who deserves a place in your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.